Welcome to the Business of Story, where we connect you with the leading minds in the art of business storytelling. Learn from best-selling authors, Hollywood screenwriters, makers, content marketers, and brand raconteurs on how to craft and tell compelling stories that sell. The Business of Story is brought to you by Emma, which provides innovative email marketing tools and services that drive brilliant results. And by Convince and Convert, digital marketing advisors and counselors to leading brands and organizations worldwide. Convince and Convert helps you gain and keep your customers online. Here's your host, Park Howell.
The mistake of my first couple of years was thinking that this job was just about getting the policy right. And that's important. But, you know, the nature of this office is also to tell a story to the American people.
What you just heard there was Barack Obama's response to Charlie Rose when he asked him what was the biggest mistake he made in his first term. You know, Charlie Rose asked George W. Bush that same question. And Bush's response was, well, I don't really think I made any mistakes. But you heard what Obama had to say, and it was about policy of being, central to the office, but perhaps even more central, especially in the American's mind, is the stories that emanate from the office, from our political figures, and to create the stories that people can live into. So here we are the day after one of the most historical elections of our time, when all the pollsters were found to be inaccurate on who they thought were going to win this thing. Donald Trump, never having held office before, never being in the military, the first time ever a business person was elected to the highest office in the land. And a lot of us, Americans, are running around, and well, the world in general, running around asking why. How did this come together? Today when I woke up, I was reading The Guardian, and they pointed out, I think very aptly, that he won because he won the hearts of Americans. He appealed to the hearts and not the minds. So on today's show, it's a special show because it's literally being recorded the day after this election. I have with me a good friend of mine, Randy Olson. Now, Randy Olson is a scientist at heart, a PhD biologist from Harvard, who went on to USC Film School, graduated from there. He was a documentarian, created several popular films, and then became an author. In his line of work these days, and what he's really dedicated himself to, is helping very smart people, primarily scientists, do a better job of communicating and sharing this wealth of knowledge through basic, basal, primal story structure. And why this is important for us today is because Hillary is suffering from a lack of narrative, and Randy agreed, and Randy showed them exactly what they needed to do. It led to yet another consult with the Hillary Clinton team. They chose to negate that input, not use it, and Randy more or less called the outcome of this because Donald Trump had a story that people could buy into, a very simple story, and Hillary never did. She had a vacuous narrative, as The Guardian calls out. And so today we're going to explore that. What happened? What went down? How did we end up with this president that we've got today, right or wrong? And what was the story structure that helped get him elected? And why this is important is because in all of our lives as business leaders and business communicators, we are forever dealing with the politics of the organizations in which we work. And so you can learn a lot from this segment about what happens at the very highest levels and how you can use this knowledge to bring narrative structure and story form back into your world to truly move people to action and give them a story they can live into and prosper from. So without further ado, I'm so honored and proud to have my good friend on the show today, Randy Olson. Welcome to Business of Story.
Thanks very much, Park. Great to be here.
Now, you're running around Washington, D.C. as we speak. I think you were over at NASA today doing some work with the folks there.
That's correct.
Or filming around there.
Yeah, working on a film about our narrative training program called Story Circles, but also here in the midst of all of the post-election analysis.
And upheaval. And it's either shock and awe or shock and ugh, depending on what seat you're sitting in at this point. But you, in the past several years, have made quite an impact on the science community, and you've done a lot of work within some of the major government bureaucracies on helping these people understand basic story structure and how to connect on a very human level. Can you give us just a quick background of what you're doing, and then let's jump in to how you got involved with the Clinton campaign and what transpired from there?
Yeah, we have this fundamental narrative template that is at the core of everything I do now, which is 3 words: and, but, and therefore. And it is the universal narrative template. And so to tell you my story using that template, I was a scientist and I achieved tenure at the University of New Hampshire, but I realized I had a bigger, broader interest in the mass communication of information in general. Therefore, I resigned from my professorship, went to film school at the University of Southern California, got out, made some films, and then began to circle back around to the science community and wrote these 3 books that are about how to communicate information in general to broader audiences. And the 3rd book came out last year from the University of Chicago titled Houston, We Have a Narrative. And it presents the model for training people in narrative. And one of the biggest discoveries I think that we've come upon is that narrative is extremely important, and yet it's extremely difficult to get good at. You can talk to people who've spent their entire career in Hollywood making award-winning films, and they still are trying to figure out exactly how narrative works. And furthermore, it's an ongoing challenge because it's a moving target. As we get deeper into social media and communicate more rapidly, the audience continues to change. And I think that that's a fundamental dynamic in this election itself.
Well, it's difficult, but you also have an extremely simple way to approach it. At least I found it. I learned about it in your second book, the first book I read, Connection, where Hollywood storytelling meets critical thinking, and it's this ABT, this and, but, and therefore form. And as you know, I use it in my classes at Arizona State University. I use it in my brand strategy workshop. I use it in everything. And in its essence, it literally is the DNA of story. It makes it so simple for people to grasp. And yet here you've got someone like Hillary that's been in this, communication political world for decades, and they still couldn't grasp it.
Yeah, my first book was titled Don't Be Such a Scientist. And that was a lightly humorous title, but what it refers to is that scientists and people who are caught up in an information-heavy world in general end up kind of losing their grasp on narrative. Narrative is something that kids pick up in an early age, and I think the brain is programmed into it. But when you get packed with so much information, you get more caught up in the information than in the structure that underpins all of our logic and reason and story and even the scientific method. So a lot of what I'm working to do is to bring people back around to realize how fundamental that is, and it's at the core of effective communication.
And your latest book that came out this time last year, Houston, We Have a Narrative, Why Science Needs Story, is all about this basic and, but, and therefore, the Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 of universal story structure.
Yeah, exactly. And we call it the ABT, and, but, therefore. And I came across it about 5 years ago, of all places, in a short documentary made on Comedy Central about the making of the show South Park. And in there, the co-creators of South Park talked about this thing they called their rule of replacing. And what they said is that when we finish the first draft of a script, we go back in, and every time we encounter the word and, we ask ourselves, could you replace that with either a but or a therefore? Every time you replace an and with a but or a therefore, the storytelling gets more interesting. I had at least 5 writing courses in film school, and yet I'd never heard story editing and structure conveyed so simply. And if there's one thing I learned as a scientist, it's the incredible power of simplicity. And in fact, Steve Jobs, that was kind of one of his mottos, that it's an age-old saying that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And one of the challenges that a lot of people dismiss it by being so simple. But the more that we've worked with, and 5 years ago when I first came across this, I thought it can't be this simple. What I did was take their rule of replacing and change that into a template of and, but, and therefore, and began to realize that this works for every good story ever told. It's at the core of effective narrative. So it's a very simple rule, and yet there's a fractal nature to it. And the basic principle of fractals is that out of simplicity, we can get complexity. And that's what you start to see. And people, I think, are starting to realize this with stories, that stories have got this core simple element of the ABT it's radiated up at all different scales.
So how did Trump do this? And do you think he did it thinking about it? I mean, was it at the top of his mind? And how did Hillary fail at this structure?
One of the overriding goals of all the stuff that I presented in my book is the term that I coined of narrative intuition. I derived that from what I learned in Hollywood, where they've really refined the basics, the science to some extent of narrative. And the term narrative intuition is derived from the term story sense that you hear all the time talked about from great screenwriters. And what this means is not that you've got a bunch of these rules memorized, but that you've worked with them so deeply, like Malcolm Gladwell talks about the need for 10,000 hours of repetition, that you work with it so much it moves to a deeper level to the point of intuition. And that great communicators have got this. Everywhere you find a great communicator, you will find deep narrative intuition. Ronald Reagan came to be known as the great communicator, and he was a great storyteller, and he had this intuitive feel for how a story is shaped in a way that holds people's interest and continues to move things forward. So I began to realize in the summer of 2015 that this guy, Donald Trump, has very deep narrative intuition. When he speaks in narrative structure. And at the core of narrative is the simple problem-solution dynamic. That's what all good stories are about at their core, is the posing of a problem and its solution. The Wizard of Oz, for example, that I use as one of the iconic forms of story, is nothing more than a problem exercise where Dorothy is stuck in a place she doesn't want to be, Oz, and has to solve the problem of how to get back to Kansas. So it's all about problem solution. I began to realize that Trump is a deal maker. I'm kind of disappointed that the pundits haven't talked more about the nature of what a deal maker is. I don't think that Trump is an ideologue. He doesn't have great depth of thoughts behind what he does. He just simply tries to make deals, and he's constantly focused on problem solution. And one of the results of that is that he's constantly speaking in this ABT form, and but therefore. For example, we love the Mexicans, and there are lots of them here, but we feel there's too many illegals. Therefore, we need to build a wall. Over and over again, you see this. And one of the ways in which he's cheated the system is by getting to the therefore very quickly, very simply, by not going into all the nuance and complexity, which is part of Hillary's downfall. She's got a more intellectual mind that sees these things in more complexity, but the masses have a hard time with that. And so Trump was kind of predestined to be able to connect with the masses by not only doing this, but in his speeches, I began to realize that he's got this ability to ratchet through over and over again, problem, solution, many, many times, because he can get to the solution so quickly. We've got a problem with the tax code. Therefore, we're going to get the best people and solve it. And everybody feels good. Yeah, he's got a solution for that. Whether it's true or not, didn't seem to bother him. He just knew how to ratchet this thing over and over again, giving the content of what he delivers very high narrative content, and that holds people's interest.
And what was his overarching story here using the ABT? Yeah,
you spotted that from the very beginning, which was that his slogan, Make America Great Again, that's an ABT. Once upon a time, we were a great and mighty nation, but we've slipped in the world. Therefore, it's time to make America great again. He had deep narrative intuition in that slogan from the outset, and he never changed that slogan one word from the very beginning. As soon as he came out of the gates, it was on his hat, and it's still there at the end of it all. He was on message throughout, and people came to realize that.
Well, we've never had a brander like him run for office. We've had, Obama, Reagan, and others that had great branders around them. But
should we call him the brander in chief?
Yeah, seriously. I mean, radio has elected presidents, TV has elected presidents. Obama certainly used social channels to further his campaign, but I mean, the Twitter sphere got him elected, it seems like, with what he's done. And it goes back to this most basic central form of narrative intuition. You talk about the science of narrative. So that's what it ultimately comes down to, is those three elements. And but therefore, setup, problem, solution, because that's what our minds are looking for all of the time.
That's right. And with these simple three elements, you can begin to quantify these things and begin to address what I've come to call the narrative imperative. And you see that in television. Television will not put up with people who drone on and on. They don't get much airtime. But if they're holding people's interest through narrative, they give them a lot of time, and you can quantify this. And I began to do that and began to realize that Trump had a very high narrative index.
So what happened with Hillary? I mean, you did have a chance to talk to Carville, and take us through that and what you tried to explain to them, this lack of narrative, this lack of substance, at least in Americans' minds, for what they were hearing from her.
Sure.
Where did they fall down?
In the summer of 2015, I suddenly had this realization that rule of replacing that the South Park guys were presenting, which, by the way, I think they derived that from a great screenwriting instructor in the 1980s, Frank Danielle. I found a speech from him in 1986 where he talked about this specifically. He said that the problem we always have with first drafts is the default nature in our brain is the and mode, where we tell a story about, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And the challenge is to go back into that first draft and replace those ands with the buts and the therefore. So he articulated it way back in 86. I think it filtered out through other screenwriting instructors. I think they probably picked that up at University of Chicago when they were studying screenwriting, and then eventually modified it into this rule of replacing. But it struck me that if you did this, if you took a text and you replaced some of the ands with buts and therefores, there would be a metric there. You would see in a boring text a lot of these ands. In a text that had been revised using this rule, you would see a shift in that ratio. You would, all else equal, you would see more buts than per and than you would in the boring text. And so using that, and the word therefore is not that common. So is the more common word used for that. But it's really these first two words of and but, because there are three fundamental forces in narrative. I believe this is what I presented in the book. And these forces are agreement, contradiction, and consequence. So it's the first two that are super important. Agreement is how we begin narratives. It's how we begin a story. It's how every movie, begins, by getting everybody on the same page. We're going to a little town. It's a murder mystery, but we're not going to get to the murder yet. So it's a bunch of and we're in a little town, and here's a family. The story begins on the word but then the father of a family is found lying dead. That's the start of the story, and the neurophysiologists are beginning to do research where they can show you the way in which the narrative part of the brain lights up on these words of contradiction. So you're basically stimulating an audience every time you're hitting these points of contradiction. And that becomes a fundamental difference, I think, in the responses of audience. If you're not giving them these elements of contradiction, they eventually they kind of tune out because they're not being stimulated by the narrative cues that get the narrative part of their brain going. So based on that, I began to look at speeches and simply count the ands and the buts and calculate this ratio for hundreds of speeches. And the patterns began to jump out immediately, which is the great orators tend to have a fairly high ratio of buts to ands. And I called that the narrative index and began to calculate it. And for example, in the great debate series between Lincoln and Douglas in the summer of 1858, they had 7 debates. And when you calculate the but to and ratio, you see almost no overlap between the two. Lincoln was way up there in the 20s. The value that we get is the ratio of but to ands multiplied by 100 to make it a whole number. And Lincoln was up in the 20s. Douglas was an and guy. And you see it when you start to look at the text. Douglas just sat there, spoke very rapidly. There are accounts from newspaper reporters that said that he was rapid fire. Lincoln was slower, more thoughtful, and he was constructing ABTs in his head. And by the way, my good friend, Park Howell, a couple of years ago, sent me an email and said, did you ever take a close look at the Gettysburg Address, one of the most popular speeches in the history of this country? There's only 3 paragraphs to it, and it's an and, but, therefore structure, plain as day. The first paragraph is setting up agreement that we've got a great and mighty nation. The second paragraph begins by stating the problem. It's the contradiction. But now we're engaged in a great civil war. And the third paragraph is the therefore, which is therefore it's up to us, the living, to make sure that these people did not die in vain. I think more than anything else that accounts for why that speech has endured over the ages. It's only 270 some words, but it's got perfect narrative structure, and it enables people to memorize it easily and to remember it.
So they had great narrative intuition back then because, of course, they didn't have South Park to be able to direct their communication. So we're just going to go with the ABT is that DNA of story. It's that universal structure to story. So you're watching all this come down, and I believe it was over the summer that you were really refining your narrative index. And then you and I had a conversation. You sent me an email, and you're like, oh, my God, the whole Clinton campaign is nothing but ands. And Trump, on the other hand, was his his butt ratio was way the hell up there. So then what happened? Because I think, did you reach out to Carville, or what went down then?
In the fall, I wrote 5 different editorials and began pulling on all the connections I had to everybody from the New York Times to the 538 blog to Slate and The Guardian and all these different outlets. And none of them took the least bit of interest in it. At 538, the editor said, we found this interesting, but we're skeptical. It just seems too simple. And so by this past spring, I was really spinning my wheels. And the pattern was so clear. The average by then of all of Trump's speeches and debate performance was a 29, higher than any other president, any major speaker I was able to find. And Hillary was way down there at a 14. So his narrative index was double. And you could see it in the text of what they say, that she was going on and on with all these facts and information. And furthermore, in the great speeches in history, you see this. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech begins, the first paragraph is an ABT. He says that we've got 5 score since a great president set us on this course towards civil rights. And he has the word but in there, but today this problem is still not solved. And he doesn't say therefore, he says, so we are gathered here in the mall today to further this cause. You see it wherever there's great oration. So I began to see this fundamental divide between the two. His ratio was double what hers was. And finally, I reached out through friends and wrote a letter. Here's what happened, actually, was honest to goodness, you could do this today. I searched Hillary Clinton boring, and the first thing that came up was an interview with James Carville, in which that was the title. James Carville says Hillary Clinton is boring, and he was very apologetic about it. He felt bad, but it's in the article there. And I realized that's the guy I need to reach out to. So I began pulling on different contacts and wrote a letter to him, and a friend eventually did get it to him. And in there I said, this is what I see, 29 versus 14. This is very disturbing. He called me up and said, I'm really interested in this. We had a hilarious phone call. And what was so funny about that experience was that I went to one professor of communications, political communications, who was a former speechwriter for presidential candidates, who I thought might help me out. And he turned on me and he said, this is stupid. It doesn't work. It's too simplistic. And furthermore, he said, you had better get your act together, because James Carville, if you get a hold of him, is only going to give you 30 seconds of his time, and then he's going to hang up on you because he's such a busy guy, which was kind of intimidating. I didn't quite think that was going to be the case. I finally did end up on the phone with him. And the day that we finally connected on the phone, the first 5 minutes was pure profanity from James Carville, going off about what are these Democrats, I'll leave out all the expletives, but what are they thinking, possibly nominating this old guy with tired ideas from the 60s of, yada, 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 excessive socialism that simply is not going to work in the practical world. So, it was minutes before I could finally get a word in there, and it didn't matter. He was already interested in the whole deal, so I didn't have to have the perfect pitch. And we had a tremendous phone call. And then I sent him a whole bunch of the stuff and didn't hear back from him for about a month and thought, oh, well, maybe that didn't work out so well. And then about a month later, out of the blue, I got an email from a person associated with the Clinton campaign who said, we're fans of your books here and we'd really like to talk with you. So I began about a 3-month correspondence with that person, feeding him all this information, analyzing her speeches over and over again, saying, look, here's the pattern. It's still going on. She's still giving these and speeches. He's continuing to do the ABT thing all the way through the late spring. He totally got it and began pitching it there. They were having Friday conference calls with the whole crew and everybody. And several times he tried to make the pitch, but just hit a brick wall. Same sort of thing. And it's tough to try. And you can read about that. Actually, people from the inside talked about how they were bombarded by every person trying to make their case for them and offering up things. So I don't blame them. It's hard to sort through all the masses of stuff. But the patterns were very, very clear, and it was frustrating at that point.
All right. So it seems like you were doing your best in there. You kind of hit a brick wall. Obviously, we saw what happened and not enough, changed in her presentation. But let's take a break at this moment for our sponsors. And when we come back, let's pick up the rest of the story of how you saw the rest of this play out. So we'll be back with Randy Olson right after this. Hey, if you like what you're hearing here on Business A Story, then you are going to love Definitive, the email from Convince and Convert that many marketers say is the most useful resource around. Each day, the team at Convince and Convert picks a topic and sends you the 3 best resources ever created about that topic. It's topical, it's timely, it's useful, so go to definitivedigest.com and subscribe for free right now. Hey, I've got a question for you. What's the best call to action button color on your website? Yeah, you probably didn't see that one coming, did you? Well, what's the best shape and sizes of your CTA buttons? And what copy gets more clicks? You know, these questions have interrupted my sleep patterns for weeks now, until I downloaded a helpful new email marketing guide from Emma called Why We Click: The Psychology Behind a Great Call to Action. You'll learn how applying just a little bit of brain science can transform your CTA buttons into small but mighty conversion powerhouses. It covers the button color, copy, and placement that helps skyrocket click rates. Check it out at myemma.com/click. You know, Emma helps marketers everywhere send smart, stylish email newsletters, promotions, and automated campaigns, and help us all rest a little easier knowing our email marketing is doing its job. So check out their new publication at myemma.com/click. You, like all business leaders and communicators, have an important brand story to tell, but it's probably not being heard. There's just too much competition for our attention, unless, of course, you tell a better story. For over a year now, I have connected you with more than 50 international story artists through this podcast to help you craft your ideal brand story for the growth of your enterprise and your people. Did you know I'm also available to you for speaking engagements, brand and leadership story workshops, even for one-on-one Skype or telephone brand story strategy consults? Plus, you can begin clarifying your brand story right now by downloading the interactive DIY workbook at businessofstory.com. You see, your sales don't have to be comedies or tragedies. You can make them epic by clarifying your brand story and connecting with audiences and customers like never before. So download your workbook today at businessofstory.com. And if you're not 100% satisfied, I'll happily refund your money. And one last thought. Just remember, the most potent story you ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a good one, my friends. Story on. Welcome back to Business of Story, and our special guest, my good friend today, Randy Olson, who has been right in the thick of this through the election season, paying attention, researching, analyzing the narrative structure of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, actually being called in and working with some of the Clinton folks, at least giving them some advice on how they could turn the corner on truly bringing some narrative structure and meaningful stories that are going to connect with Americans out there. And here we are, we come back into the story, and this is all happening around August, right? So they've got about 3 months to go for election. What did you see at that time when it felt like maybe you weren't getting anywhere with Clinton's group? What was Trump doing? How was he getting better at this?
Well, you know, it had been such an ongoing problem. And actually, another little tidbit to toss in there right at the very beginning. Thomas Friedman of the New York Times was on Meet the Press in August of 2015, and he said verbatim on there, the problem with Hillary's campaign is they have no message. And so that continued to reverberate over the months, and they just really didn't have a message. And you saw they kept changing their slogan, I'm with her, stronger together, just casting about, none of which are particularly narrative slogans. And in the meanwhile, as I mentioned, Trump, this deep narrative intuition manifests itself in so many different ways. And not just the way he talks a problem solution, but also this thing that he came out with of labeling these opponents with one-word labels that he never changed. And so, you know, it was...
Crooked Hillary is an example?
Lion Ted, all of them, you know, what Little Marco. And that, again, is a deep understanding of the singular narrative, that not with these complex descriptions of them, boiling it down to just the one word that encapsulates the whole vibe. And that everybody knows now. That worked to his advantage. He had these clear labels. That's all narrative principles. That's the power of the singular narrative. So in all different facets, he had a deep feel for this. Now, what got interesting was in about June was when both campaigns ended the primaries. They both had their victory speeches. And what was kind of sad was the night of Hillary's victory speech in Brooklyn, the one where she had the glass ceiling above her, all of a sudden, in a single speech, all of these suggestions I was offering up, of which there were 5 or 6, you know, have an overarching ABT, open with an ABT, have a high narrative index, but to and ratio, bring in historical perspective, have a clear singular theme. And that night she opened with a clear theme about the glass ceiling, and she was in a building that had a glass ceiling. And so suddenly, and that speech, I think, had around a 25 for its narrative index. So suddenly she jumped way up. And I thought maybe somebody was listening, but then within a few days, she was right back to the same old pattern of just scattershot all over the thing. Another suggestion was giving speeches that could have a title to them. When you look at Martin Luther King's great speeches, the great ones have got a title. And after the tragic shooting in South Carolina, she gave a speech in St. Louis, and she referenced one of Martin Luther King's great speeches. It was about the Rip Van Winkle speech about don't sleep through the revolution. And, she knew that speech because it had a clear narrative structure to it. It told a story, had this title. But unfortunately, the best she could do was just point to it. But her speech itself rambled all over the place. So it was this ongoing pattern of just and just got very sad and frustrating. And another suggestion I had offered up was the need to finally find a singular narrative. And a suggestion that I offered, I know didn't get anywhere, but there came a pivotal moment where Bernie conceded. And what could have and should have happened with the two of them going off and coming back with a singular theme. And I suggested, nothing more powerful than a single word, and equality could have been a word that unified the two of them. They could have stood there under a banner saying, everything we stand for is equality, and it's written into the Declaration of Independence. And yet they failed to take advantage of that. So they never did get a unifying theme with Bernie, which it was a tragedy because that, clearly was at the core of his entire messaging. And he had a much clearer, he had a clear narrative, which was basically in simple words, eat the rich, enough of these rich people. And they couldn't manage to find that. So kept missing over and over again. And then the crazy thing that happened was when Trump gave his victory speech, he read it off a teleprompter it wasn't the first time, but it was talked about, really prominently for the first time. And suddenly he brought on Paul Manafort, suddenly started to get more cerebral about his campaign. And guess what? His narrative index plummeted, went right down to about 10. He spent the summer fumbling around, started giving really bad speeches. He lost his mojo. Matt Taibbi had a cover article in Rolling Stone that was titled How Trump Lost His Mojo. He didn't get into the narrative dynamics, but that guarantee was a major factor going on there. And so Trump floundered through much of the summer, and eventually brought on Kellyanne Conway. She helped guide him back a little bit. But none of his speeches ever got back up there because, and the question that the media never really asked was who was writing those speeches on the teleprompter? Because previously he was proud of the fact that he was impromptu, speaking off the top of his head. And guess what? It was all coming out with deep narrative structure. But once somebody was writing speeches for him, it no longer had that. And that's, a lot of his fumbling through the summer and losing his way. And eventually, he found his way to where they are now. But there were other little moments like the night of the Democratic National Convention, Bill Maher had Michael Moore on his show. And Michael Moore, people are now pointing to the fact that he said then Trump's going to win this thing. And one of the things he said that night was Trump knows something that nobody else does. He somehow has figured this thing out. And yeah, he's got deep narrative intuition. That's it. Where did he get it? Aside from his basic nature, he worked in television for a lot of years. And as I said, television's got this threshold where they will not tolerate you if you don't have high narrative content. And furthermore, you saw it from the beginning. I couldn't believe what MSNBC was doing from the outset, which was preempting their broadcasts to cover every speech from Trump live. They didn't do that for any other candidate. I don't know that anybody's ever done that sort. Everybody knows this now. That's all the free airtime that he scored. And again, he was above. I would even hypothesize. I looked at a few television documentary series and calculated the narrative index on them, and they're all above 20. So I would offer up that hypothesis that there's sort of a threshold there of you got to stay above 20 to hold the television audience interest. And Trump was doing that naturally, and I think that's the major factor to account for. Yes, he was provocative and wild and those sorts of things, but it's at a smaller scale that holds the attention of people, that he's constantly building to these points over and over again, not rambling. On the long term, he did ramble, but everything on the shorter scale was all ABT over and over again.
So let me ask you, I want to read you something from this Guardian article today that you know me because I've ranted to you on several occasions over the year that this is really about pop culture versus political cronyism. And it's the strangest election that, of course, I had ever seen. And in this article today, they were talking about celebrity and how celebrity plays so much into America. And where I'm going with this is when people are using the ABT and they have this narrative intuition, it can be used for good and evil. I mean, it's so powerful. But what they say here, and this comes from Gwenda Blair, one of Trump's biographers, says it gave, and this is in relation to his 10 years on NBC as The Apprentice. So he's got, is really honing his narrative intuition. And quote says here, it gave him 10 years of being in front of the American public, being the boss, being CEO, hiring people, famously firing people, being the guy who can fix it, the one who knows everything, being the big authoritarian, patriarchal guy. And then she goes on to say, and this is kind of the scarier part for me anyways, I think that has imprinted on a lot of people that they trust him, quote unquote, that makes him trustworthy. That combined with the reality TV phenomenon in which it became acceptable to have something that wasn't really true, it legitimized a kind of not quite true thing and shifted our idea of what's an acceptable version of reality. So the argument there could be that, Trump, here he is, he's got this great narrative intuition, honed from great American TV culture, such as, reality TV. And so when he's on stage, what is real and what isn't real? And how can he use this narrative intuition to truly manipulate the audience? Or is it real? I mean, that becomes the big question for me anyways. Well, what do you see is really what you're getting?
I would offer up 3 words to encapsulate almost all this stuff, which is that narrative is leadership. And anyone running workshops on leadership, if you're not delving into narrative, you're missing the whole point there, because people don't listen to leaders that don't have this narrative quality. People that are boring and confusing, nobody follows. You've got to maintain people's interest, and that's at the core of narrative. It's challenging, it's difficult, but Donald Trump had it. And by the way, over and over again, what was the punchline of his whole show? You're fired. It wasn't some long-winded discourse that he gave to people. Got right to the point of these things over and over again, bullet points, and able to hold that attention in a society that's got a dwindled attention span from all different sorts of distractions.
So then you might argue that she was status quo not only within the political doings in Washington, D.C., but status quo on how she was trying to win people over through the and boring leadership, trying to win with policy when people are really looking for promise and emotion in those stories. She
hit a point where she addressed this to some extent and just basically said, I know I'm kind of boring, but, that's what you get with me. And that just isn't good enough in a world that is so narratively driven as we have today.
Yeah. So what is the finding then for all of us? If narrative is leadership, what do leaders in their business environments that are often very highly politically charged, what do they need to do to get better so that they can move their people forward into authentic stories where they can really prosper from them?
Well, if we lived in a world where the fundamental criteria of leadership was simply physical fitness, what would leaders do then? They would go to the gym and begin lifting weights and trying to get physically fit. So the analogy that we draw now, coming out of my book, is the training program we put together now called Story Circles, and it's narrative fitness training. And the way it's set up is not in one-day workshops. We've come to the conclusion that one-day workshops of storytelling do not work. They can excite people and get them interested. It works as a teaser, but if you really want to make a difference, you have to commit yourself to a long-term regime of working out the narrative part of your brain. As I said, the neurophysiologists are beginning to show that a large part of your brain is involved with narrative. And we know, one of the anecdotes I tell was I went to film school 22 years ago. I entered in the University of Southern California Film School with 50 kids that were all 21, 22, not one of whom could tell a story well to save their souls. I had to sit through so many boring writing classes with these and stories. It's a story, and a guy gets a gun, and he drives a car, and. And many of those people that were my classmates then are now screenwriters in Hollywood. I run into them at cocktail parties. I say, what are you up to? And now they say, well, I've got a script at Paramount, it's kind of like The Matrix meets Die Hard, and bang, bang, bang. They have shaped the narrative part of their brain over the course of 22 years. It is possible. You can move the needle. And I would recommend to every executive, anybody involved in the world with a lot of communication, that they commit to some means of long-term narrative training, working that part of your brain.
And I seen you in action because I was at UCLA a couple of weeks ago when you were doing one of your Story Circles trainings there, and you had a room full of, 30 or 40 people, most of these academics. And in there, you could see the doubt in some of these people's minds. I mean, they even raised their hands, and you weren't necessarily attacked, but you had a number of people in there say, I'm not really sure this works, or this seems manipulative, or are you sure it just seems too simple? But by the course of those 3 hours that you were in there working, it was really amazing the transformation I saw in some of these big thinkers' minds of is kind of this, holy crap, there's actually something to this. Our brains are actually set up to do this.
We've had a couple of major revelations along that front. Last year, we ran the first 4 prototypes with NIH and with USDA. And the group of 5 scientists at USDA got to the end of the 10 one-hour sessions that we run them through. And there's no lectures involved in this training. We just give them the templates at the beginning. Then we provide them with the raw material to do the workouts, and then they use their own material to do the workouts. We got to the end of the 10 one-hour sessions that were stretched over 10 weeks, and I interviewed the 5 of them in this story circle. And at that point, they weren't sure. Some of them said verbatim, I'm not sure how useful this is going to be. In July this year, a year later, we brought back 2 of them for a panel discussion, and they said, over the past year, this has changed how we read, how we write, and how we think. It took time for them to begin to apply this ABT basic approach and begin to, and that's the whole thing, is that it's not until you begin to hit your own realizations like, oh my goodness, that's how it works, as you begin to transform material, that it begins to resonate deeply with you. And that's the whole catch of it is, whenever people run these things, they always want to do an evaluation right at the end. It's no good doing that. You got to give it a year. It's back to that Malcolm Gladwell thing about it takes a long time to start to enter into the realm of intuition. But when you start to get there, it's a one-way path. All of these people, once they've gone down this pathway, it's changed how they approach all their material. But in a world of too many people and too much of a rush and short attention spans, it's hard to get a lot of them to understand that you've got to commit to the longer term, but that there will be a payoff. And
yet there's only 3 elements to it. That's what I found. And I, of course, have used it over and over and over again, but it comes down to 3 basic primal elements that if you use this becomes the foundation for your entire presentation, be it a PowerPoint presentation, a proposal to venture capitalists, a new ad campaign, copy on your website. It can basically all function from this ABT. The simplicity is almost a downfall with many people because we've had some people that have said, I got it, and but therefore I'm all set, thanks, and they leave. But those 3 words, that template becomes a wellspring to radiate out into all of this knowledge that you begin to get as you start to get the feel for these 3 fundamental forces of agreement, contradiction, and consequence. And also, a lot of people feel like they got this in grade school. They got some form of it. They got the standard elements of drama. But this is the first time it's been boiled down to, as you say, the DNA of story, these 3 words. And what's so important is the first 2 words, and but, are so extremely common that they have no information content by themselves. They are structural words. One of the fascinating things, some bioinformatics guys I'm working with now who work in a field of the field of text analysis, and there's something called sentiment analysis, where you begin to take a text and you analyze all the words that have sentiment to them. And guess what the first thing they do in sentiment analysis is? They throw out all the ands and buts. And I say back to them, one man's trash is another man's treasure. You think those words are worthless, but when it comes to narrative structure, those are the key words that set up these narratives over and over again. And, setting up the agreement, and then but, starting the contradiction in the narrative process. So it would seem to me there's a whole new market for you out there, Randy, and that's the political world. Before any of these people want to run for office, they should really get their narrative intuition tuned up and flex those muscles and understand what their major policy points are and the positions they're going to stand on so they've got some depth, but truly bring story to it so it connects with people first on an emotional level, because we all know we buy with our hearts and we justify those purchases with our heads.
And as you know, and you've told me with your students, and I do this all the time, somebody comes to you with this whole big agenda of what they want to present. And the first thing you and I both do is stop them and say, stop right now. just tell me this whole thing in one sentence using and, but, and therefore. And the first thing you see is their eyes rolling back in their head as the narrative part of their brain starts to light up, and they slow down and they begin to put this thing together. That's the beginning of tapping into the narrative realm. And until you're into that realm, you're just not really drawing on the power of narrative. And people have said in the last 10 years or so, it's become an overused buzzword. Storytelling is magic. We got to draw on story. But so many people say we know that, we just don't know how do we get into this actual story thing. And the answer is this ABT. It is the magic bullet. 5 years ago when I came across this, I was skeptical in the beginning. It can't be this simple, but we're up to our necks in it now. And as I say, everybody that enters into this thing, it's not a one and done type thing where you kind of get it. Most of the people, when they start to really put the energy into it, it blossoms out into more and more. And as a matter of fact, what we're getting now are some of these circles finishing, and they don't want to quit. They said, we did our 10 1-hour sessions. Can we keep this thing going somehow? Because they're up to their necks in these really interesting discussions, and they're hitting these points of realization like, oh, that's how it works. Oh, I see how it applies here and there.
Yeah. So what is your ABT? You're 20 years down the road, and you have to describe the outcome of this election one day after. What would be your ABT for this election?
And if you were here, you could see my eyes rolling back in my head as I try to activate the narrative part.
I know it.
My brain. There was this guy, and he was broadly known and popular, but the Democratic Party didn't take him very seriously, but they took him literally, and therefore the door opened wide for him to work his narrative powers, which is, I think, the most important factor that got him to where he is today.
Yeah, and therefore I would say something along the same lines is you had this rich real estate New York developer, and being accepted by the elite was so important to him. But status quo and those folks in that area just kept shunning him. Therefore, he ran for the highest office in the land in a bombastic campaign using the power of narrative intuition to seal the throne.
And if you and I were on a media team, we would now spend the next couple hours simply working on this ABT. And it seems so simple. And then you begin to parse it and pull it apart and realize, wait a second, you've got 2 or 3 narrative threads going
right
in there. And that's what goes on in the development process.
Yeah. Well, I can attest the ABT is a fascinating, very, very powerful structure. And it's been fun talking and listening and receiving your emails throughout this entire campaign. And I got to tell you, I was surprised as anyone last night. I did not think it was going to be close. I thought Hillary was going to win out no matter what. And when he took it over, I was blown away. But I think it just goes back to everything we've been talking about, and you've been really espousing on this narrative structure. America used to be great. It's not great anymore. I'm going to make it great again. It almost seems like we're simpletons here in America to buy into something as basic as that, and yet it comes down to, I guess, how we're just simply hardwired.
It's been a lot of frustration for me in the past year and a half as I've tried to I had these 5 editorials I tried to get published, and people began to say, oh, so you're a Trump lover. No, I'm analytically looking at this and trying to warn everybody. Just as Michael Moore was saying, the guy, Michael Moore couldn't put his finger on it that night on Bill Maher's show, but this is what he was trying to put his finger on, I think. The guy has got deep narrative intuition, more so than any political candidate that I've seen, and that's what I was trying to warn people of, and it's really frustrating to burned up so much energy and really gotten nowhere, just hit a brick wall with all of these different journalists in particular said, no, it's not that simple. Well, it kind of is. Yeah,
but you're doing great things with the likes of NASA and the USGA and others that you are working with thought leaders, folks out there that really count, that are making a big impact in our lives, and you're helping them with their narrative intuition so their big thoughts can be sent out, shared with us, and the rest of us can appreciate and embrace what's going on with them.
It's extremely gratifying when you can watch people traverse this arc of being skeptical in the beginning and then hitting these moments. As you said in that UCLA workshop, that we get that every one time we run these things. And, the way Story Circles works is 2 parts. We do a 1-day teaser thing to give people a feel for it. And then the ones that get lit up are the ones that we put into the circles of 5 people that go the full 10 1-hour sessions. And to see them get to the end of it and they're getting it finally, they're starting to feel some intuition and they don't want to quit.
Oh, that's great. Okay, Randy, how can people learn more about you, your work with the ABT? Where can we send them?
The book is on Amazon, of course. Houston, we have a narrative, Why Science Needs Story. And don't be chased off by the word science in there, because these are universal principles. The and but therefore underpins everything going back to the Greek myths. It's at the core of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. It's at the core of all great movies and things like that. So it's extremely broad. I'm increasingly doing workshops now with diplomacy folks in the business world and all sorts of other disciplines. They're all getting it. And our website itself is called storycirclestraining.com that lays out the basics on it.
And you can follow Randy on Twitter at ABT Agenda. You're always sharing lots of good stuff there.
Excellent. Yes.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much for being here. I know you were swamped. You were shooting all day out there at NASA. So I really appreciate you being on Business of Story today.
And I'll offer up my final comment, which is that I'm a long-term Democrat, and I'm really disappointed hearing all these people sounding defeated. I mean, more than ever, it's time for people to double their efforts and get back to work on this. And mastering narrative is at the core of making all this stuff work. So it's time for people just to dig in even deeper.
You know, I'm with you, Randy, and what I told a lot of my folks today, I had a webinar, really rotten planning on my part to have a webinar at 10 a.m. following the national election, presidential election. But I told my folks, it says, it doesn't matter who's in the White House. They're not going to look after you. You are the only one that's going to look after you. So get on it. Really understand what your story is, live into it, and help those around you live into their most powerful stories. And so having you here today helps us with that. I really appreciate it.
You betcha. Be the master of your own narrative.
That's it, man. And I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in literally to this special edition. I wish I had, if you have Jade there, have her do some sound effects in the background of our story election coverage following the monumental election of Donald Trump to the highest post in the land. So thanks for listening. And again, hopefully you've taken away some things that you can use in your world as a business leader and communicator to help you craft and tell compelling stories that sell. And of course, visit us at businessofstory.com. I got a ton of tools there for you to help do this. And share this with your friends and family. Let us reach out around the world. Go to iTunes, give us a ranking, and give us a comment on what you like. And if you have anyone that you like on the show or something to cover, please send me a note at park@businessofstory.com. So thank you for listening. And until next Monday, have a wonderful life.
Thanks for tuning in to The Business of Story. Don't forget there are terrific free storytelling resources for you at thebusinessofstory.com, where you'll also find the complete show archive. The Business of Story is sponsored by Emma and by Convince and Convert, and is produced by Convince and Convert Media. Find more great shows like The Business of Story at marketingpodcasts.com, the first search engine for marketing podcasts. Podcast imaging by AudioBag.com.